Emergency debate is about to get underway in about 7 minutes' time in the House of Commons over the Keystone XL pipeline. Conservative leader Erin O'Toole requested it after U.S. President Joe Biden pulled the project's permit on his first day in office. Alberta has $1.5 billion invested in the pipeline, and the Premier has guaranteed another $6 billion in loans, in backing loans. The Premier also says he wants compensation from the U.S. or retaliation like economic sanctions as a result of this decision. For reaction, I'm joined by Alberta's NDP leader, Rachel Notley. She's with us from Edmonton. Hi, Ms. Notley. Good to see you as always. Thanks for making the time.
I'm glad to be here.
I wanted to start off on the subject of sanctions. I had the Deputy Prime Minister on a little bit earlier. She wouldn't unequivocally say no to pursuing them, but that's certainly the impression I was left with. Do you think the federal government should pursue sanctions?
I honestly think that there are so many issues going on right now that while we need to be engaged in conversations, we need to look at what the overall implications are to all workers in Canada and in my case, in particularly in Alberta. And I am not convinced that starting a trade war in the midst of what you were reporting on even today is the best way to pursue any kind of retaliation with respect to Keystone. I think that Jason Kenney's attempt to equate it with other incidences where we have had tariffs is not really, that doesn't carry a lot of intellectual water. And I think the fact that you haven't actually seen any other conservatives specifically calling for tariffs is somewhat indicative. So, what we've got here is a premier who is frantically trying to distract from the fact that he rolled the dice on somewhere between 1.5 and 7.5 billion dollars belonging to Albertans on a project that most people knew was in great jeopardy.
I want to ask you about the investment in a second, but as far as the Premier has backed his call for sanctions by saying, or addressed the motivation for them by saying this was a project already in construction and canceled, after that construction had retroactively canceled. So there has to be some sort of consequence for it. I take your point on sanctions. What about compensation? Is that something that you think should be pursued?
Well, they can pursue it to some extent, but let's be clear. There was roughly 2 kilometers of pipe in the ground at the border and 3 or 4 pump stations south of the border. But what we most need to see is that he released the deal, so we have an understanding of how much we are on the hook for this deal. So I don't know how we pursue compensation when Albertans themselves don't even know whether they lost 1.5 or 7.5. And I am concerned that we've got the Premier running around pretending to be a lawyer, making ridiculous assertions that we have a strong case when we know what the presidential permit said, and it made it very clear that this was always an option, even under President Trump. And so, again, I think what we're seeing is a desperate attempt to suggest that there is a way to recover the money that the Premier has lost.
Is Keystone dead from your perspective, Ms. Notley?
I'm not in Ottawa. I'm not there, in Washington. I'm not speaking directly to people making those decisions, but certainly from the outside looking in, it does appear to me that it's dead. Let's be clear. TC Energy itself said it was looking at walking away in the spring of 2019 because it believed that Joe Biden was going to kill it. And the fact of the matter is that the time to fix this problem was, over a year ago when this Premier had the opportunity to truly establish Alberta as an environmental leader. To now try to dine out on the federal government's carbon tax while at the same time being in court contesting it either suggests an incredible level of duplicity or the Premier believes he's going to lose that court case. Either way, fighting those who are trying to combat climate change tooth and nail for the last 18 months was not the best way to convince an administration that Keystone was something that could fit into a climate change plan on a continental basis.
The Premier says, though, that and I asked him about the investment, obviously, last week, that he insists that it was responsible. And I'm wondering, as someone who also made an investment into rail, for example, to get the product out of Alberta, if you have some empathy for the position that he expressed, which is this was the only way to get the project rolling.
I don't. I absolutely believe that I have empathy for the fact that he was told that in the first round of negotiations, but I don't believe this was the way he should have gone. You know, we as a government supported Keystone by committing 500,000 barrels per day. Should it be built? Yes, we did invest in rail, and we invested over $3 billion in rail, payable on receipt of 4,400 rail cars. We did not invest over $3 billion in rail in association with crossing our fingers and hoping someday we might get the rail cars. And that's in essence what Jason Kenney did. So it was incredibly irresponsible. He had no agency over the very regulatory uncertainty that was jeopardizing the private sector investment. And that is what distinguishes the Keystone investment from either TMX or crude by rail.
So should he have just walked away at that point? Should he have just said, this thing isn't getting built, and said, okay?
No, I think there were probably other strategies that could have been put into play to keep the project alive without running holus bolus into throwing $1.5 billion at it. There are ways to keep these projects on the burner so that they can be revived without necessarily having to do the headline grabbing rolling of the dice of $1.5 to $7.5 billion belonging to Alberta.
What's an example of something he could have pursued?
Well, again, I was not at the table, but I would suggest that there are ways one could have negotiated with the most immediate pressures that the company was experiencing in order to keep their line in the water, as it were, without insisting on pushing ahead and making all the purchases that they did and committing all the money that they did. And these things can be slow walked. We've seen it on other projects. It wasn't necessary to go at it the way he did. But either way, at the end of the day, what we know is that it was at great risk. And you don't invest taxpayers' dollars into something over which you don't have some level of agency or authority. And we don't have agency or authority over the U.S. courts, which of course were also jeopardizing Keystone, or the U.S. electoral system.
I entirely take your point on all that, but I think what we also don't have jurisdiction over is the domestic political environment in the U.S. And what we have seen is Keystone has become this ultra significant flashpoint for particularly progressive Democrats. And certainly it seemed like to a certain degree, Joe Biden was appealing to them. I'm wondering, from your perspective, as someone, I remember covering your opposition to Keystone Pipeline prior to you becoming premier. That's a set of beliefs that you used to talk about, and I know that you changed your position. You used to talk about, for example, being opposed to the pipeline because it was carrying unprocessed or unrefined crude. It still would be doing that even when you did support it.
Yes, that's true. And honestly, one of the things that happened when I became premier is I got a lot of very comprehensive briefings on how all this worked and how it contributed to both jobs and fiscal sustainability in the province of Alberta. And, we learned that having adequate takeaway capacity was critically important to ensure that we got the best price for the product. And, when we saw the price differential growing out of control in the absence of that, that's something that you need to take action to fix. Keystone is an insurance policy. Line 3 and TMX deal with our takeaway issues, or Keystone on its own would have dealt with our takeaway issues. But so that's where we learn those things. Although I will say, Vashi, that even with that being the case, our government also invested a lot of money in doing more upgrading and value add in Alberta. And quite frankly, I think we should be doing more of that. And unfortunately, Jason Kenney is not really acting on behalf of these energy workers who are losing their jobs because he's got a one and done tax cut policy, and he's thrown all this money at Keystone, and yet we're not working on diversifying our energy sector sector here at home and getting more value about it from it. And we had been doing that work, and now that's slowed, and we need to be doing better there.
Okay, I have to leave it there. I wish I had more time because I could do a whole another 7 minutes on upgrading. Lots to talk about there, but I will leave it at that point. Thanks, Ms. Notley. I do appreciate you making the time.
You bet. Take care.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.